Emily's background is in kind of science communication, science engagement, informal science learning, would you say?
Yeah, good list of terms.
And you worked at University of West England?
Yes.
And also at King's College?
Yes.
Well, you're at King's College
I am
now.
At King's College, and I was at UCL.
Yes.
I like to have a string of, universities.
She's working her way around the London colleges.
Yeah. Well, we got a house there now, so I've got to,
You've got to stay there.
We've got to stay there.
Anyway, we all know what Emily's going to talk about because she's very kindly sent around her title and abstract, so I shall hand over.
Cool. Thank you very much. So I thought we'd start with, this is a sort of evil game I've played before called, what's the worst possible science communication, public engagement, or informal learning practice you can think of? And I asked that question on Twitter on the train this morning and had no one's being very public with it. So, you could keep names out of the specificities, but people were direct messaging me quite horrifying stories on Twitter about projects they'd done and the mistakes they'd realized only after they'd finished a project, about how off-putting a £25 admission cost might be to people, or things like that. So I just wondered if we could, before I go through and do a kind of, these are all the things that my research would suggest, I just wondered if we could, because I'm guessing you all have some background in public engagement stuff, from the people I've Google stalked already. So I'm thinking, any examples of some bad practice, some stuff that might put people off in engagement land?
I don't know whether it put people off, but there's a sort of, I've tried to do a schools thing and then completely hadn't realised that the students had left.
So school projects during holidays. So I suppose timing is the overarching issue there. Any more for any more?
So imposition of agendas.
So your agenda being imposed? So imposition of own agenda. And give me an example of what that might be. The ubiquitous one is learn to love science, but
Yeah, that would be, particularly in our area, would be pretty prevalent.
Yeah, I might write science evangelism down, just because it's one of my favourite phrases. Any more for any more?
I suppose if you're working with a partner, misrepresentation of them in some way through your own actions.
Yeah, that would be bad.
Not necessarily on purpose, you'd hope not on purpose. It would somehow damage their reputation or the message they were trying to send out, or contradicted it.
Yeah, or destroyed their audience as well as yours. Yeah.
There's dangerous practices.
Oh, physically dangerous?
Yeah. I won't give it here because we're being filmed, but I can think of one fairly recently which was pretty dangerous. And
what happened? Do you think would unethical be associated with that? Because I'm just thinking of some projects.
I think that's a big issue. Actually, it's a really big issue.
Yeah. So some amazing projects being done with people's blood, with no health and safety stuff around it. It's like, oh, okay, great. Go for it. You've had your.
I was going to say, focusing on that particular moment rather than what it might mean for people involved afterwards. So whether they changed or learned from it, rather than just being there.
So what are we going to focus on?
Lack of focus on follow-up, understanding.
So that's sort of to do with exit strategy as well. Because I mean that's
a tricky one.
Heard discussed is we go and we do an intervention as a group. I mean it's like, oh great, so we've got our research objectives achieved. We've got some nice data we can write it into a conference or journal paper. We will go us, the funding council will love us. You don't think about your participants and actually what almost leaving them bereft when you leave with whatever shiny intervention you went in with, and what do you leave them behind?
Without the capability to carry it on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's something actually I myself and I have spoken about a lot before, it was sort of saying, do we have an ethical responsibility as researchers to think about, our exit strategy essentially.
I think it also partly relates to attribution for contribution. So it's partly kind of respect for what people are giving to the project and having some way of acknowledging their contributions to it.
Does that reflect an ownership as well?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. It's a distributed ownership if it works well. Therefore, it should be a distributed attribution.
So I've got here attribution, disrespect, lack of ownership. I'm going to put tokenism here because I think that, to me, would cover a lot of stuff. So it's a kind of that it's our agenda, we're going to do some stuff. You might be lucky enough to be allowed to collaborate in the planning of the intervention and the doing of the intervention, and we're going to take it away. We're going to do some other stuff with it, try and get another project. You're now left without resource or people, and your participation has really been quite used, as it were, rather than anything else. Okay, cool. Any more to add to that? That's quite a healthy list of unpleasantness, which is awful to have around. So let me give you some. I'll go through this, and what I was saying to Trevor on the walk over here in the rain was, normally I do this kind of presentation for a mixed audience, which often includes a lot of science communication practitioners. And so I often try and focus on being positive at the end. And this is my gamble, right? Because you guys aren't quite that audience, I thought I'd just go through a straight critique. And if we all feel too miserable at the end, we could try and be constructive. But I'd be really interested to sort of have your views on just the straight critique of practice. And I also thought I wanted to say that I watched a bit of Trevor's presentation, and what I was going to beg you to do was just ask me questions as we go through and get involved rather than leaving me hanging at the front chatting. And I can chat away, it's just it's less fun on your own. So is that okay? Fab. So I think this will click through and I'll stand way closer to you. So there's a sort of research gap in the universe of science communication, public engagement, informal science learning, around this idea of equity and diversity. And it's quite a peculiar research gap, and when I started researching in it, people kept saying to me, why do you care? You look pretty white, what's your problem? And so that's an interesting position to come from as a field of practice and a field of research. And so that's where I've spent a lot of my effort in the last few years, and found out some relatively unpleasant things that are fairly distressing on the level of this sort of list. So I think this list is relatively representative of the kinds of practices that actually are pretty prevalent in the field of public engagement and science communication. So what do we know already? Well, we know in science communication, and I'm using that term very broadly, so it would cover kind of public engagement remit, but also this learning stuff that isn't about engagement in a political sense, as well as the more political stuff about consultation. We know that stuff happens with a very typical set of usual suspects. So we have kind of big level descriptive data about the huge cohorts of white middle class urban families who go to visit science museums, who enjoy science festivals, who are able to participate in local or national government consultations, and the huge, like the reams of school groups that also use a lot of these opportunities. And what we know from projects like the Wellcome Trust's Informal Learning Review is that those opportunities cluster around those who already have resources. So if you're already pretty well resourced, you're in a much better position to kind of suck up or mop up some of those other resources. And the spread of resource across the population is not that great. There's another issue in public engagement research, depending on which subfield you're looking at. So there's the critical social scientists who look at science engagement, and they're kind of critical, they'll pull out problems. But in the research on informal science learning, that's a research field based on advocacy. They are all, and a lot of my work and some of the work that certainly we've done at UE is about what's good about this and how can we promote it. We want to have more of this, we think this stuff is great. So to have that critical voice sometimes is really hard. And a lot of the work has been done on how learning happens in a science center, with very much kind of step back onto, when learning might not happen, or what does not learning look like, or what are the problems about getting in the door in the first place. So I'm trying to kind of give you an idea of where I'm coming from on that front. There is so then this question of what about everyone else? And a lot of the work I've done is in London, which is super diverse, as the geographers call it. It's not in any way a particularly narrow kind of population. There's huge variation across any kind of social demographic factor you could think of. But the people that use the wealth of science engagement communication resources are from a pretty small group within that. So what about everyone else? Are we not worried about that? Is that? One of the issues I face when I do this talk in other groups is this idea of responsibility. And what people say to me really often is, well, look, we are a small science communication group. We do these kinds of projects. It's not our responsibility to cater for everyone. We, have core audiences, and that's what we're up to. That's our business model. And that is, if you're thinking about it like that, it's pretty rational. But if all of the core audiences happen to be the same audience, maybe we've got an issue there. And then there's this question of responsibility. So whose responsibility would it be to think about equity? And actually, in the same way of Hannah Arendt's, it's everyone's responsibility means maybe it's no one's responsibility. And what kinds of problems does that make for us? So that's the kind of depressing beginning. So in this sense, who is the public for public engagement, and who doesn't count? So we have all this lovely work on publics and science citizens, but who's the science non-citizen? Who's the non-public? What does that look like? And then this is the constructive stuff that we can come to at the end if we're feeling too glum. Is that how would we construct a more inclusive kind of science communication, whether in terms of research agendas or in terms of practice? You all still with me? Does that sound too glum? Cool. So the framing I wanted to talk through with you guys is this idea of barriers and I'm not into the barriers. That would be a quick way of framing it. So essentially what we have at the moment is this kind of idea in terms of how people understand why people don't participate in science engagement, science communication. And it's pretty, in a way, straightforward. So on the one hand, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you can't afford to go, you're not going to go. That would be a financial barrier. If you live in the middle of Merthyr Tydfil, it might be hard for you to get to Techniquest in Cardiff. That's a pretty obvious geographic type of barrier. If you're not interested, and that's where we come on to the sort of the more agentic barriers, if you're not interested in science, it might seem kind of peculiar for you to go to a science discussion event in the Dana Center after work. That might not be high on your list of fun things to do. And this is really common. So if we look at the policy literatures, we look at the practice-based literatures, or we look at research on this stuff, this barriers thing's pretty common, and pretty much what a lot of the outreach stuff is based on. So if you talk to people about how they're doing a more inclusive project, often they'll talk about trying to overcome an interest barrier or a financial barrier. And I'm going to argue that that's not really good enough. So to me, this doesn't do enough and actually exacerbates the problem. So to me, the barrier thing is difficult. So there's obviously an issue to me of multiple barriers. And when I talk to participants, they're experiencing like a huge list of these things in a sort of structural level. It's not one, you can't just give them a tenner and they'll get on the bus, that won't do it. But it's also not a question of disinterest. It's not that simple. They're not just unmotivated. They're not culturally deficient. They do loads of stuff. They just don't do this. So to me, this doesn't really account for enough of what's happening. But it also doesn't account for some pretty big kind of social issues about power, about domination, about who has the cultural authority behind them. I was recently at an event about mainstreaming science as culture, and the issues there are really about, well, whose culture is science, and whose authority would that kind of bring up, and who does that work for and not work for? And I think what I would argue is when we base our outreach or our inclusive practices on a kind of barriers perspective, I would argue that we really reinforce or reinvent and reinterpret the reproduction of disadvantage. Because if you do a one-off program where you get some people into your science center and then they do a short program with you and then they go away again and they never go back, what are you really saying about that? Is science then for everyone? Is science learning opportunities for everyone? Can everyone engage with science? I don't really think that's changed anything. And I think we also have to recognize that people see and notice tokenism. So that doesn't go unnoticed by the people we might be trying to work with. And in that way, I think, can really kind of solidify experiences. So the study I wanted to talk you guys through is in the UK, and it was my PhD study. And it was a qualitative study, and I did a year of, well, I did a sort of almost 2 years working with 68 groups, but I did a year of working with 4 groups who stayed in the project all the way through. And it was in southeast London, and it was between the council estate I live on and King's. And King's is in central London at Waterloo, and I live in Camberwell, and in between there's Elephant and Castle and the Walworth sort of area of Southwark, and that's where all the community groups I worked with were based. And in terms of social demographics, I was trying to overlap maximal disadvantage, essentially. So I was looking for people from minority ethnic groups, but also who lived in poverty, and I was trying to see what those would look like. So it was a sort of ethnographic study of the most, from what we might know from literature, the groups most likely to not participate. So those are the people who worked with me over the whole year and did sort of all the bits of the project. So that's a Sierra Leonean group, an Asian group, a Somali group, and a Latin American group. And they were grassroots community groups, so they were self-constituted. They weren't service provision groups, they just were there hanging out with each other, and I hung around until they let me stay, basically. Over that year, the stuff I'm going to talk through today is the 4 focus groups, which is 1 with each group, 32 interviews, which were a mixture of sort of, in a way, sort of pre and post, because we did accompanied visits, but also just ongoing interviews throughout the whole project. And sometimes with the same person again and again. Lots of field notes. And then I think that's actually words of field notes, because there's not like a separate dissertation-sized book of it. And then these 4 accompanied visits to informal science learning environments. And what I want to say about that is I actually went into the project thinking much more broadly, that we might just get them to maybe participate in a local consultation project, or we might be able to, there might be some national science and society stuff that we could kind of get involved with as well. But I gave them the choice of what they wanted to do. And if you think about that landscape of science communication and engagement, which is pretty messy, the only things they wanted to do were museum-type things. And I would argue that that's because they're the most visible to people who don't do. They were pretty invisible anyway, but they were the most recognizable. It's also worth pointing out that when we talked through the political stuff, and I did sort of explain that to them, and we talked a lot about it, the idea of being involved in that in a meaningful way was laughable. It was a joke. It was so sort of redundant and irrelevant, and they're literally saying things like, well, we wouldn't be listened to anyway, so why bother with that? So in terms of the visits they chose then were to 3 science museums and the science centre, and that I think is quite telling in terms of what people see of the kinds of work that we're involved with. So these are the visits. So there were 33 participants across the 4 groups, but the groups went separately within their own group. And 2 groups independently chose to visit the same science museum. They're all in London, and they were all sort of heavily documented. So people had mics on them, I had microphones, we took pictures, they took pictures, I made notes afterwards and before, and we all went there together. And they sort of spanned from 3 hours to a whole day. What that meant was we had loads and loads of data, and so I started going, well, what am I going to make of this? So the first way of coding it that I tried to apply was this quite commonly known in the land of museum studies, which is obviously not a small land, is Falcon-Dierking's contextual model of learning. So that really looks at, personal context of learning, the social context of learning, and the physical context of learning. And in museum studies, it's a pretty classic model. You might look at all sorts of different kinds of learning environments and use it. So I thought that made sense. That would be quite a straightforward way to do it, and I would apply that model to the data that I had. What that showed up was that none of these learning contexts really applied, except in reverse or in a sort of negative image. So there was the sort of personal learning was really fraught and quite difficult. The physical environment was really set up so that people would struggle. And the social environment was one of like mutual support in the face of overwhelming odds. So it was, in terms of looking for not learning, that was really the thing that came out of that initial wave of analysis.
Can I just ask, when you were setting up those visits, did you set them up as, we're going to go here to do some informal learning? I mean, how did you sell it to them? How did you tell them?
So I tried to sell them. We're going to do... So I'd been in, by the time we did the visits, I'd been basically hanging around with these groups for about 6 to 7 months. And they saw the visits as a way in which I was doing something for them. So they thought they were doing something for me in letting me hang around. And then the reward, in a way, was these visits. And I created, because there was, I mean, the initial stuff and the other data from the project that I'm not going to talk about too much was, you know, we don't really know what this stuff is. We don't really like science. We don't know where these things are. We know nothing about how to do it. You know, these are very alien and very invisible. So some of the focus groups and some of the beginning work was around like, well, what is this stuff? And they definitely saw me as a science insider. That was very clear. And so I was going, well, there's all these different things we could do. Here's a big list, but I'm also going to describe it to you. And a lot of people use the list as a resource as well. So a lot of people had that list for their community center, and that they thought that was a great thing to have. And I saw it as, we're going to go and do a thing, and I want to be there, and I just want to see what happens. And I told them that my research was about equity, science communication, and understanding what happened in these places. But they didn't know, for example, they didn't know I was in an education department, and they didn't know sort of that I was looking for learning or I was looking for engagement or anything like that. But then they all chose a sort of, they didn't choose environments that were politically aligned at all, and they didn't choose environments that were just, because there are some, so you know, the London Zoo's on the list. And that in a way is more fun, social, and the learning is perhaps slightly less tangible. It's not designed in quite the same way as a physical space. But that wasn't chosen, which I thought was very interesting, because what I would have expected would the zoo to be more popular than some of the museums. So I think they sort of went thinking they were having a fun day out, and that was certainly the positive finding that comes back from it, is that they did have a nice day out, which I would argue isn't enough, given the resource and the effort we pump into things. I would say we're not doing our job if that's all that comes back. Any other questions before I roll on?
Do you think they deliberately chose like the science museums because they saw you as a passport to get into a place that they thought might be interesting, but they couldn't see a way for themselves to get to?
I think yes and no. So some of them had been to a science learning place, but most of them hadn't. And the ones that had been were a mix of people who'd gone one-off. They were all seen as tourist attractions. So the London Dungeons and Madame Tussauds are described in the same sentence as the Natural History Museum, and as the same kind of place, and as having the same kind of high expectations of entrance costs as well, which is interesting. But they were all described in terms of not wanting to go there, not for us. And the ones, so one of the things I did in the sampling was try to sample across a mixture of ages and genders, and people who had been brought up in the UK as well as newer migrants. And of the people who'd been brought up in the UK, the ones who'd been to school in London had been to some of these places with school, but described it as a kind of punishment. So one of the Smiley participants talks about being taken to museums through school as a kind of detention, and a way that their teachers used to punish them at the end of term when they couldn't be bothered to plan a lesson. And looking at the research on setting up teachers to use these kind of environments, that's not outside of the realms of possibility, I think. That seems quite rational. So I think there's an initial attitude, there's an attitude against these places. So on the one hand, they sort of thought it might be interesting and useful, but they would never have gone without me. And it was a sort of, I think the fun day out, me buying them lunch, me busing them somewhere, and having some time together was more of an appeal than the place.
Was it possible that they didn't choose the zoo because like they were in a relationship with you and they wanted to choose something that they thought was science and didn't think of the zoo as being anything to do with science?
Maybe. I mean, the list we had was all sorts of different places. So it was like the old operating theatre, which is a garret in an attic in London that has an old operating theatre in it. So there were lots of places that didn't seem very sciencey. I had botanic gardens on there, aquarias, as well as the sort of museums, social history museums that had some natural history collections in them, as well as the big London kind of science institutions, different royal societies. Kew Gardens was on there. So there was and I tried really hard in that sort of pre-visit stuff to broaden out that depiction as much as possible. So I think what they saw as science was something we talked about a lot. And I think they did include the zoo in the science place. I think possibly with the zoo, It was more that they might have gone there on their own. So that would fit more with Anne's idea of, was I a passport of some kind that was made tangible opportunities that they might not otherwise have considered? I don't know.
Was there any, or did you do, I don't quite know how to ask this actually, but was there any alignment with their interests? You know, did you do anything to find out what they cared about, what motivated them, what interested them prior to making up the list? Was it a conscious effort to make it not interesting? Or a
no, so I actually
got stuff.
One of the things I realised in doing the project was I really struggled to not want them to like it. And that's quite interesting, because so the Somali visit was really pretty bad. And I really struggled after that to be like, I must get them another visit. I've got to sort out something that will definitely be good. I've got to start checking things out that would be, you know, that I can guarantee they'll have a good time. And that to me was a bit about ethics, because I was, you know, getting people to do stuff for my PhD. They're not getting that much out of it. And I wanted them to have a good time, and they didn't. With the list I initially constructed with every single sciencey thing in London I could think of, including quite a broad definition of science, and the political stuff and the learning stuff. And then as we chatted, if they thought of something or had something they wanted to do, that would go on the list. So one of the groups wanted to go to the Chelsea Flower Show. And I was like, that would be great. I probably can't stretch to that for the 14 of us at that kind of cost, but you know, great idea. What about the Chelsea Physics Garden or Kew or something like that? So I actually was trying to look for things that would be fun and enjoyable for them. And we had done a lot of chat about, you know, what do you think of science? How is science at school? What kinds of things do you do in your spare time? And I think this is my argument about these are far from culturally deficient groups. They did a huge amount of stuff in their spare time. They just didn't do this. Yeah.
I just want to ask about the Science Centre, what was possibly the motivation for them to choose that? I can understand the museums to some degree, but what sold the Science Centre to them? So
that's slightly a mystery to me, and I asked. I was shocked, because that was the group who were...
more hands-on?
It was lots and lots of computer interactives, right. That particular Science Centre thing they did. And that was the group who were considering the zoo really strongly. And I came back a week later and they were like, right, we're going to the Science Centre. And my jaw fell open. I was sure we were going to the zoo. And that was a Somali visit, and it was the worst in that sense. The learning opportunities were almost impossible to access. It was incredibly off-putting in so many ways. And I really afterwards, I was like, what if we'll just do an extra visit and somehow I'll pay for it and we'll go to the zoo, something must be better. And I'm not sure what motivated it. I think if you look at the transcripts around one of the focus groups with them, they were talking about doing things that they had never even possibly thought of before. So the newness and the novelty of the Science Centre might have contributed there. I don't know if because they didn't know what they were going to, and I'd explained, but I don't know I don't know quite how that went over. And these were computer literate people, so the way the computers didn't work is quite interesting in itself. And yeah, I think that to me it's a real outlier of a visit in a way, especially given that two of the other groups chose the same museum to go to, and had there was the most familiar in the way that there was quite an obvious choice, and I almost thought they might all choose it in that sense. Cool. All right. So let me show you some more and more increasingly upsetting stuff about these places. So contextual model of learning was a bit of a no-go. So I went sort of hardcore in what I consider hardcore. That's Bourdieu. That's bell hooks. And that was the sort of secondary theoretical framework. I was like, right, we'll just go in there with critical pedagogy, and we'll go in there with huge bits of social theory about the reproduction of advantage and disadvantage and what might be involved in that. And what I liked Bourdieu for his work in distinction and this idea about museums and elites, and his work on schooling and how people opt out of things that are set up against them. That started to resonate with me. But Bourdieu has a few problems. He's not, totally a feminist, which is a shame. He also doesn't really consider ethnicity that much. So I was building in intersectional theorists and trying to talk about what that might look like. So drawing on bits of critical race theory and queer studies and feminist studies and trying to broaden that out a bit. And I also wanted to look at critical pedagogy in terms of how could we look at what's happening in these places and talk more clearly about power and advantage and disadvantage. So that was the second big theoretical framework I used in the analysis. Oh, I think that just went. So this is what I did. I mapped habitus across all the groups, which uses all of the, what do you like, what do you not like, what do you do, how is school, what do you do at home, how's your family? I traced capital, which is what I'm going to talk through mostly in the examples. So I was looking at what capital they needed to be able to be successful in these environments. What kinds of capital they could possibly accrue by spending time in these environments. Could they learn science? Would that be considered accruing a kind of cultural capital? And whether there were kinds of capitals to be exchanged either in this informal science learning environment or out of it afterwards. Did it have some value later when they were back in their community groups or back in their schools or family settings? So this is the long list, right? So this is all the different kinds of capital that I was able to map and trace, but not necessarily in a positive sense. And the symbolic violence at the end, to me, started to be about, okay, if we can actually look at all of this, we can trace where the symbolic violence is in this system. So things that are seemingly open, seemingly accessible, aren't actually, depending on what social position you come from and what you bring with you into the space. And actually that builds up as a problem. And I'll go through it. So I was trying to do all of that while paying attention to these kinds of intersectional issues. So the idea of how people inhabit different social positions, especially in migratory positions. The idea of identity work and what that might mean, and how people might sort of, in a way, some of my Colombian participants inhabited so many different class positions, depending on whether they at that moment had thought of themselves as being in Elephant and Castle or in Colombia in relation to their relatives. And this overlap of ethnicity, gender, class, and age, because there were all of these kinds of issues going on in the data. It's a big mess in that sense. And so then this is the kind of normative, I can't help myself, I want science communication to be good and better. I wanted to really try and help us understand what actually is happening in exclusion. If this barrier stuff isn't enough, can I provide an alternative way of looking at this? And can I do that in a way that would be helpful, that could actually try and make practice better? It's a sort of very jolly hockey sticks ending. I was like, please, let's make this better. So the results, as you might not be surprised by now after my diatribe to realize, were pretty much heavily, this is an inaccessible and exclusive system. It's probably not a surprise. There is, in a way, what I started to unpick was there's almost an ideal visitor, that the institutional habitus of these kinds of science museums or science centers are set up towards working with. And if you don't fit that ideal visitor character, it's really hard for you to get much out of that visit. So the ideal visitor I started to build up in terms of there are assumptions around capital. There are assumptions about what you bring with you. And whether or not you have that capital means really whether you can engage or access any of the learning opportunities, the social opportunities, the fun and silly opportunities to do any of the things in these spaces. And this is a sort of, even once you're in the door, you get yourself in the building, there are still problems. So in terms of this assumed capital, and I'll take you through an example, there are huge assumptions made about the economical capital visitors bring to them, not just in terms of entrance fees, but the cost of sandwiches in shops. My Latin American participants were horrified to see donation boxes full of cash, and to them that was a symbol of extraordinary richness in the institution, but the institution was still charging them £8 for a sandwich. That felt like a real mismatch. Everything for them was covered in the project, but they still came away going, this is extraordinarily expensive. This is not something we could come back to. Everything here is, if I want to get my kid a bouncing ball from the shop, that's £5. I can't do that. But they want something because they see the shop, and then I feel awful. There's also this idea of economic capital, free time, and the sort of working class habitus. So a lot of the people I worked with are on back-to-back cleaning shifts, or they're working massive nursing shifts. The idea of having a Saturday or a Sunday free to go and do something like this was totally alien. It's not something they did. So the cost of free time was also a bit of a misnomer. The idea of the cultural capital stuff is quite interesting. So there's a load of cultural capital around science. There are assumptions about what science you know already when you go into these kinds of places. And if you don't know that, you cannot understand what's happening in, say, a computer interactive that asks you to understand the difference between gut cells and sperm cells, which we'll look at in a second. that would then tie up with cultural capital around what do museums and science centres do? What's the point of them? How do you negotiate and manage them? How do you get yourself through these spaces? What should you be looking for? Are you just walking from the cafe to the toilet and back? Or is there something else you're supposed to be doing? What is an exhibit up to? How do you use it? What are you trying to get from it? What is it? This was all quite nebulous. This was something that people didn't come with an understanding of. There's also a linguistic issue which is twofold. So one was very much about science language. So some of the terms used were just very confusing if you didn't have that sort of cultural capital of science education. But there was also a very literal language problem. All of the participants who worked with me could good enough English to speak to me and back, or it would have been very hard to do the project. But that didn't mean that they could read English fluently. And as soon as they got into these kinds of environments, they were completely linguistically blocked out of everything to really quite a high degree. And I kind of expected it, but was shocked by how incredibly full on it was. So for example, in a computer interactive, one of them had English audio coming over the speakers, English audio coming from speakers in the ceiling, English text on a big screen in more than one place, all at the same time, and the text was moving. There was no way of slowing it down or repeating it, and they were being asked to do things. And that was literally impossible to follow even before you got to the other issues, because they couldn't understand the English fast enough or well enough to do it. But that also applies to just straightforward exhibit text if you're looking at some dried scorpions and you can't read the label. So across all of the groups, label reading was really fraught. And even understanding what was in an exhibit or a gallery before you went in there was a problem. Let alone, one of the big anxieties people talked about was knowing how to get out. There was a real concern about, I'm in here, I'm stuck, how do I get out? I can't come back, no one's here to get me out. It was a real anxiety. And the social and symbolic capital are also in there. So that, in a way, there was some social capital to having gone to what they saw as a high status place for a day. So they did go back and talk about it. But they didn't talk about it as a thing that we should all do. It was more of a, I went to this thing, I'm briefly inhabiting a slightly more special social space than normal, but these aren't really places for us. And there was more of a social distance between the institutions and their visitors and the participants who were working with me. And in terms of symbolic capital, they really read those spaces as not for me, not for us, not for people like me. And the language thing was a big issue there. So this is, I mean, my depressing point is you get people in the door and it really makes no difference. So this is, and I'll read it out to you because it's a bit full on, but this is in the Science Centre, and I'm using it as the sort of the crucible of worstness, which is a really academic way of putting it. So Deepak is a facilitator, and this is a facilitated session in a room full of computer interactives. And we booked the session. There were 3 Somali women coming from that group. They knew there were 3 Somali women, and so we had Deepak facilitating us. And he'd spent a lot of time at the beginning trying to establish a connection between him and these women. So he was saying, you know, I grew up in a council estate in the northeast of England. He was from a Southeast Asian background, so he was trying to do some identity work. But he also is doing another kind of identity work around his science identity. I am a science student, I love science, science has saved me, I have a job because of science. That's how I got off of my council estate, quite in this sense, the evangelical pro-science talk. And through the session, that gradually alienates the 3 women completely. So he asks them questions, and at some points they say, I don't know, I can't answer, stop asking me. And he's asking them, like, what do you think a gut cell looks like? And repeatedly. So this is one of the games, as they called it, in the center. And this is him really trying to facilitate them in an introduction to the game. And it wasn't until I listened to this afterwards that I realized actually he's shouting most of the time. And these are 3, you know, a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old, and a 40-year-old. They're not making a lot of noise. And they're pretty computer literate, so they all have smartphones. They're all sending money home by, you know, transfers on their phone. So Deepak's saying, have you played Top Trumps before? And shockingly, none of them have. That's a pretty culturally English game that children play in schools. So he says, the card game, have you? No? And Idil, who's one of the participants, she eventually says no, and there's a sort of pause, because you can feel that they're not wanting almost to try and do this. So Deepak says, all right, so this is a 2-player game. You've got these categories, you need to pick a number that's going to be higher than hers. So Idil says, okay. So Deepak says, so the number 10 would be higher. You pick the card, but if you think your number 4 is going to be higher than hers, like for example, the gut is a lot bigger than the area where the sperm is. So just press on that. So it actually turns out that there's a lot more sperm in the body than gut cells. And she's, you know, so she wins the card, and it's your turn again, he says to Nadifa, who's the other person that they're doing this two-player game with. So Nadifa says, ooh. Deepak said, did you get all that? So go higher than hers. And this is also kind of awful. So try not to lean on it, remember? Because they're touch screens, right? So Adil says, okay. Deepak says, so you need to lift up your other hand because you're leaning on it. So pick a number that's going to be higher than hers. You've trumped 700,000. Her number's a lot bigger. She has 20 million. So you win the card because it's winner stays on. And this is quite hard to understand for me, and I play top trumps. I'm good at top trumps. And I've got science degrees. I understand about gut cells and sperm cells. But this, A, is a lot of information altogether. It's actually characteristic of all of the talk from that session. So it's dominated by the facilitator, with at best a kind of okay or an O or a how from the participants. This is the ideal visitor stuff. He was really tuned up, I think, to working with big groups of school kids who are perhaps unruly, who need to be given quite clear instructions. At some points, he actually shouts to them to sit down and be quiet, which was quite shocking because they were not being loud, and there was really no need to shout. And there's a confusing amount of information. So he's introducing two quite different things at the same time together. And that's a lot of stuff for them to deal with. So they really struggled with this. And the comments they made in the follow-up from this visit, in the months and weeks that followed, were things like, I was just playing his games and I was winning without knowing why I was winning. I was very confused by what was happening. This made no sense to them. And in a way, it might have been that the Science Centre was the worst of the visits, because in the others, they had tangible objects from the real world, right? They had living and dead animals, they had living and dead plants, and that perhaps is easier to connect to from your own personal experience than a computer active in a foreign language where everything's moving very quickly, and they're trying to not only teach you how to play the game, but what the science content is at the same time. So, I'm getting close to finishing. So I'm going to argue this is a resilient phenomenon. It's really hard. This stuff is embedded in practice, but it's also embedded in people's expectations, and their expectations are met, if not exacerbated, by the practices they encounter. And what people came away with, people went in with, this isn't for us, it's expensive, it's unwelcoming, it's confusing, and that was only confirmed through what happened. So they went away with this kind of habitus reinforced, this science isn't for us, these institutions aren't for us, this isn't somewhere we should go, we won't change our practices around this. But I think what's interesting is if you look at the practices in these learning spaces, exclusion was embedded in them. It actually would be, it requires quite significant across-the-board change to make a big difference there. And so I think, to me, that's a mutually reinforcing cycle. So in terms of the reproduction of disadvantage, you have non-participation, active decisions around non-participation, but also socially exclusive practices that go round and round and mutually reinforce one another. So that was what makes such a resilient platform.
So can I just ask, sorry, just going back,
yeah.
I missed it. Your chap Deepak, was he part of the Science Centre, one of the helpers that was there? So this is some guy that obviously has a lot of experience with engaging with the public on a day-to-day basis. Kind of makes you wonder what, I don't know, with not knowing him and not wanting to cast aspersions, is he qualified to be doing that? Because he obviously hasn't got a sense of cultural differences, how people might not have a British background or upbringing and so wouldn't know cultural norms. I think there's also maybe something there about the gender, the way he's speaking to people. And
also gender was, because these were 3 Muslim women who really, I mean, none of the Somali men wanted to work with me for very understandable reasons, and so it was the women who worked with me. And they knew it was a Somali Muslim group coming. So in that sense, there's issues.
But I mean, even just the language he's using, and I mean, from what you said, his approach just makes me think, who is this guy? Is he new to this? I mean, I can't think that, I don't know, I mean, people must apply for these jobs, they must be qualified and are appointed to these jobs because they felt they can do a good job, but it strikes me there are other people maybe better suited to doing that kind of work, maybe he's just to have roles within the Science Centre.
So initially I really came away like, what was happening? Ugh. But I think, the more I thought about it, I think this is relatively common. And I think it comes down to institutional expectations and norms, and I think this is the way he's been trained.
Right.
And I think this probably works for 99% of the groups he encounters. So when he's got a group of 25, 11-year-olds, that situation probably runs quite differently. Still, from a critical pedagogy perspective, kind of problematic power issues, but he probably can get a group of 25 noisy 12-year-olds through that whole exercise, in and out, getting all the things done, getting everything, you know, taking place. They probably have an exciting time, and maybe they learn stuff because they're probably coming from a science class with a teacher. And I think, to me, this speaks to the idea that a lot of the practices we have strong expectations of being sort of okay, they're quite normal, actually don't work except for that ideal visitor character. So as soon as you're not ideal, none of this works.
Is there anything then around the institutional sort of script, if you like, about what they roll out to who? And is it more around actually the organisers need to think about how they make this more accessible to different
Definitely.
cultural...
Definitely.
Does this place have, for instance, internationalisation in terms of, say, language?
Yeah.
Do they have...
And so all the Somali participants were like, at least Arabic would have made sense, or an international...
Exactly.
So they were really actually...
Even European languages
Yeah.
in London will have a lot of tourists.
Yeah, and so their expectation and their comments afterwards were really interesting because they didn't want to blame the institution, which I think to me is symbolic violence again. So they felt at fault for not knowing enough English and not enough science to do this properly. But they were saying, well, actually, we would have expected some translation. We know it's hard, expensive to translate into every language, so we wouldn't have necessarily expected our language, but we would have expected some of the international languages, and they suggested Arabic and French. And what's also, these are not linguistically deficient groups. They are, I can speak 3 languages. These guys are speaking like 6, 7 languages. It's just that English isn't the best one for their reading. And England, the UK is, I think, quite unique in that when I go abroad and take pictures of text in science centres, because that's how I roll on holidays. People love coming on holiday with me. But there's 3, 4 languages in a lot of other countries, similar institutions. And here we have a real issue around English as a dominant language practice and what that means.
I feel like going to some places in France, it's quite like that as well. Like
Yeah.
protections about their language.
Yeah. Whereas in Denmark or the States, they've kind of gotten over the language issue. They just accept the need for multilingual interpretation and provision. So yeah, I've been sort of talking about this increasingly as institutional habitus. This is an institutionalized way of thinking and behaving, designing exhibits, training staff, setting up, you know, outreach events, and it's...
Just out of interest, have you seen any places around London with similar sort of science, these aisles, informal science learning environments that actually do have better provision for international cultural diversity, or are they all pretty much as bad as each other?
So the session I used to teach at UE... The session I taught at UE was about inclusive science communication, so I did collect examples of best practice. Most of my examples aren't UK-based.
Right, okay.
There's the odd one. I mean, the Horniman Museum, I think, is definitely better than all the other ones in London. But it's still looking at some, you know, still almost exclusive use of English. But they do amazing embedded long-term relationship building around community groups. And the South London Gallery, which is an arts institution, has almost like shockingly collaborative power structures with local communities and council estates that they're based in. So there are people doing different things, but it's certainly not mainstream, and I think hard. And one of the things I found really interesting with the gigantic recession that we're all enjoying is watching the outreach or inclusion officer positions disappear from the bigger science learning environments. So they seem to have gone in the first or second wave of redundancies, which to me is quite telling, but it's me being mean.
You've got kind of 2 difficulties going on in this conversation, haven't you?
Yeah.
You've got what you might call...
Well, I think
Deepak's positioning himself as a scientist, and clearly he's understanding the science, although he's not doing a great job at it.
Yeah.
But there's also what you might kind of call a pedagogical issue, isn't it? That he's been, as you said, he's been trained in a particular way. What he's not doing there is understanding the processes that the people with whom he's interacting are going through. There's no kind of sense of analysing the learning, is there?
And there's no what we might call basic constructivist pedagogy. So he has no idea where they're coming from, and he doesn't actually ask the whole time.
And then there's possibly some cultural issues there as well, because
Yeah.
if you've got a man with some women there, especially maybe from a certain cultural background, he's talking about sperm straight away.
Yes.
You know, I mean, already that might be making them feel uncomfortable as well, because there are some cultural norms where someone has been more sensitive in terms of science subjects than others. So I think there are multiple
Is it an expectation that is that exhibit supposed to be intuitive? Are you supposed to be able to do it without support? I mean,
I'm not sure. I've never seen it with another group.
I'm just thinking, is he been sent in there to firefight? Yeah.
So it's a completely facilitated session.
Yeah.
So you get met by your facilitator, and they do this whole hour and a bit session with you. So that there's no visitor is ever with those things by themselves. And I think what he's used to doing is doing a quick, this is how it works, bang, 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 off you go. And I guess that works most of the time. And it just didn't work for these guys for a range of reasons. And I think we're looking at power, we're looking at some bad basic teaching, we're looking at some confusion around science background knowledge, but we're also looking at a practice thing, like how to do the thing. They didn't really even, like it might have been worth having a game of top trumps first before getting into science top trumps, potentially. How long do I have? I'm sort of aware I've chatted away for an hour.
Sorry, it's 2:15.
Should I wind up? What's the end? 2:15?
We're going to finish at 2:45.
Oh, okay, cool. So we've got half an hour then for a chat.
Yeah.
Fab. All right, so I'll just go through, so that's just more depressing findings that I tried to describe. These, I think, so this is the other stuff, the bigger picture stuff. So this implications for theory idea, I have the barriers issue to me is problematic. And I think one of the things that doing this project really kind of beat into me was the idea of foregrounding the experiences of this other, that actually you don't really understand what's going on, and you'd better ask. And you might as well privilege that position, because in not doing so, I think we risk a lot of kind of continuation of problems. And what's interesting is that seems to be quite rare in terms of how we understand things like learning in informal science learning environments, that it's very much based on what we know from the visitors that do go, and then extrapolating that as though it were a kind of normative base to make claims about how other people might learn or what other people might do. This is, so in terms of trying to be a bit jollier, I think there is stuff here around what we might call hybrid or cross-cultural learning that people working in multicultural education settings are building up. And I think that would apply here. So in a sense, it's just basic constructivism, but it's about trying to figure out where people come from, what their interests are, and how to then better design, better scaffold, better create practices that would work for them. And perhaps you might have to do that by working with them. And you might have to explain enough to get their buy-in rather than just doing it in a 2-week project. And a lot of the best practice stuff that I'd managed to pick up for this class at UE, and if you look across where things seem to work, it is about long-term projects where you build relationships, where you have a more equal power balance between partners. And this idea of, I think there is some potential here for developing more inclusive institutions, but the risk obviously is that they will eventually dwindle. So we have to decide if these are worth, pursuing as an investment. And I think this going beyond learning, so I think there's a lot of stuff that happens in these places that is really interesting and isn't about learning. And I do a lot of work on learning. I think learning's pretty interesting stuff. I'm pretty open about a broad definition of learning. But I think there's other stuff that can happen here. And I know that sort of Falk and Dierking, for example, are maybe epitomize the tradition of focus on learning. And it's really only in the last sort of 15 to 20 years that informal science learning environments have been about learning. And that's been about justifying funding in the face of other kinds of cultural institutions. And it's a shift and it's a relatively recent one. But if we think about what else they might do, I think people like Elaine Heumann-Gurion's argument about third space is quite interesting, and some of the people doing space geography are quite interesting in terms of, if you're looking at diversity and cultural kind of division, actually getting people into the same space to be next to each other as a starter step to then actually maybe hanging out with each other and then talking to each other and then actually having sort of mutual respect for each other and their backgrounds might be quite an interesting thing to do. And some colleagues in Israel are looking at how that might work in their setting, which is obviously more extreme than central London. But I think that's an interesting thing to think about, what these spaces might afford if we're going to continue putting this level of investment into them. And I think this is a big one for me in terms of the sort of theoretical shifts that I've gone through in terms of how we understand stuff. And I think there's a lot of scope for trying to be a little bit more theoretical about some of this work that perhaps is perhaps not always done or sometimes resisted in my experience. So thinking about what social structures might afford or not afford in terms of opportunities and how they might constrain or provide opportunities for certain people. What that might look like in relation to individual choices, and then how that might all come together in practice, and thinking much more broadly about what these kinds of practices might do, and asking those bigger questions about equity rather than just thinking about barriers. There's also a slide which is, so this is from an amazing museum in South Africa who do a lot of work with trying to kind of breach social division in Cape Town. So I think what those kinds of examples are doing that we don't do here are taking responsibility for exclusive practices. And some of the museums in Cape Town really have done such different work that they've gone away from, traditional museum-style models of learning to something much more active, something much more participatory, much more community ownership with a specific political agenda. So there's a colleague of ours called Andrea Bandelli whose work is around, are museums political? And this idea that, science and museums and this kind of cultural authority is still somehow apolitical. It's an authority without a bias behind it. And actually what some of the slightly different work that I really like is taking the approach that actually this is political and this is explicitly our political agenda rather than not dealing with that. So I think one issue is to take responsibility for exclusive practice rather than saying, we do great work with our core audiences and I just can't do that other stuff. I think actually we have to be a bit kinder, more generous. I think we have to recognize some of these things, and they're kind of hard for people. So the idea that we are designing environments around an ideal visitor, and that leaves other people out. This idea that making science learning or science engagement inclusive is not going to be very simple, it's not going to be really quick, it's probably not something you can do in a one-year project. But if you don't start to think about that in the longer term, we've got some real issues around sustainability, longevity, and what it means to do this kind of work. And I think this is where I would put most of my money on in terms of developing practice, and I think it might be around co-developing practice in the long term, in a trust-building way, and recognizing that that isn't easy, that it is resource-intensive, but it might actually be an important step to take if we're going to look at any change. And I think the change that we might need is considerable. I don't think it's a simple tweak, and that's why I would make that argument. So, thanks very much for listening to me. The happy slides are at the end, so we can come on to them if you want, but I thought it'd be really nice to get your feedback on that.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Cool. You can drink water now.
Right, okay, so we've got a bit of time for questions for Emily. So we take about, take about 15 to 20 minute questions, and then I'll straight over to you.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to nip off.
So get your questions in now then.
So I'll get the question in now.
You are.
Yeah, I'm Fiona Reeve. I'm from our Faculty of Education and Language Studies. And you mentioned briefly at one point that, in a sense, this engagement shouldn't really be, I think you meant only about pleasure. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about the role of pleasure in making this an experience people might want to come back to, and then how we define pleasure and how we expect other people to feel pleasure then would be something that we could explore as part of what they like about this experience.
So I think what really struck me from this was where people talked about having fun or having had a good day out. When you look at it, what they meant was, it was fun to hang out with my 5 friends. And actually what the environment contributed to that was really very limited. And so I was asking them questions like, so if we'd gone on so the Asian group had a picnic in the museum because they were concerned about cost and they were concerned about having the right kind of food for their religious preferences. So we had a picnic, which was great, and that was the thing they liked most about the whole day. And I said, well, if we'd had a picnic somewhere else, would that have been as fun? And they were like, oh yeah, that'd have been great. You know, and actually, one of them was saying it would have actually been more fun to have had just a picnic at the community centre or in someone's house. So when they talked about the enjoyment and the fun, actually what that came down to was doing something different, getting out and about for the day. They spent time together, which they felt was important. And then the sort of the strongest argument I could make for the development of social capital was a lot of them did go back and say, hey, I went to this place, and they saw these as high status places. So they briefly did then occupy a sort of link to that high status place. In spite of this, we're not going back. It's not something we would do again. And so the thing about not being just about fun to me is, if we're going to have something like a science centre, and people enjoy it for the sake of spending time together and having an opportunity to do that, then what distinguishes that place from a playground, or from, you know, going for a hike in the forest, or from watching TV at each other's houses? What is it then that starts to make those places different? And of course the argument for the last 15, 20 years has been learning. But I guess from this I'm not sure we can substantiate learning across the board for different kinds of visitors. So it's a slightly difficult word. So on one level I want them to get more out of it than just fun. But I think without any fun, like, who's going to go? Like, these are, you know.
But certainly exploring what might be the pleasurable elements of it from someone else's point of view seems like a...
And certainly the sociability there is a big issue. And I think, so if I'm going to be really mean, one of the leverage points I think that we have as a, like if I say we as that kind of institution or that kind of field of work, is that people want to spend time with their families, they want to spend time with their kids, they're super busy, and what they start to prioritize is the idea of if I can do a thing that will benefit my kid, I want to do that thing, and I will prioritize that above just going to the park. So that's, I think, a little leverage point where we can start to say, okay, well, you could have fun with your kids in these places, and it would perhaps help them a bit at school or something. And there's some leverage there that's quite interesting.
Particularly if you're linking it then to a social learning experience as opposed to the notion of an individual interacting with an exhibit.
Yeah, and what we know from some of the research in the States is that actually a lot of the kind of 2.4 family thing doesn't work in massively diverse groups. So when you're going with your 2 aunties, 1 of your grandparents, 5 of your cousins, and your 7 brothers and sisters, cost is much higher, effort of moving all those people is much higher, and it has to pay off. So in that sense, the local museums, I think the Horniman in a way does well because it's embedded more locally. It's a bit easier to get to if you live in Lewisham than somewhere in central London. And if you can all have a fun day out together, actually that's a huge win. If we can do it, and I don't think do it right now.
I'm going to jump in there. I mean, yeah, just picking up on some of the things Fiona was saying, which is kind of maybe, you mentioned South Africa, which I thought was a really interesting example, and when you were talking there, I was immediately thinking of New Zealand and Canada, you know, and obviously you mentioned I wondered to what extent any of that kind of literature and practice from those kind of contexts was transferred to the UK.
Yeah, I think it's not there. Which is a really brief answer to give. I don't see it. So I think there's the only place. So there's issue one is how do you get literature into practice, and that I think we know from doing the Informal Learning Review doesn't happen right now. And that's a problem. Yeah. Issue 2 is then what literature can you try and weasel into practice, and how do you talk about it? Yeah. And so some of the stuff like Glenn Aikenhead's work, I only know because I've trawled through a literature in a database around multicultural science education and indigenous knowledge practices and what that would look like. But I think it's very hard for practitioners to do that, and let alone know what the right search terms would be. I mean, it's not like I found them straight away, and I'm sure someone put me onto them, you know. Yeah. So that doesn't seem to come through, and I think, and this is maybe too cynical, but to my mind, I think there's a resistance as well. So because of this sort of business model, around that whole sector, which there is, you know, funding is being withdrawn all the time. It is publicly funded, but not completely anymore. And so there is a kind of like, well, we have core audiences, we have to serve them, and in doing that, perhaps we leave out a lot of other people. Also, there's issues around workforce diversity, and creating cool stuff for people like you only really goes so far sometimes. So that's where some of the research in diversity, I think, and critical pedagogy starts to become really useful.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's right at the top level. What do you think the museum is for? Is the biggest question.
And if the answer is me, it's not really that good. No.
Yeah. If it's about shared learning, you start telling a different story. Which is what they've done in Canada and New Zealand.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's South Africa.
And what I found really interesting in South Africa, so I went to South Africa as part of a workshop, but then spent 3 extra days going around all the museums in Cape Town, because this is what I do on holiday, right? This is why Tom won't let me go to Berlin. But some of the curators and the people in those museums talked about critical pedagogy, and I was amazed. I was like, this has somehow made its way into practice, perhaps because the need is so great. Whereas maybe we think we can get away with something else because our need is not so severe. And equally, these colleagues in Israel are looking at such an extreme situation in one way that they're having to work differently. But I don't want to wait for things to sort of take that degree of, I guess, breakdown before we start to think about inclusion. I mean, that seems crazy. So misery.
Trevor and Anne, I think both have their hands, and then Nick. You want to go first, Trevor?
Yeah. So it's really good. Thank you very much. It's really interesting talking myself for all the ideas and stuff like that. I guess part of my thing is trying to understand where you'd like to go with this. And you've identified a lot of barriers, and I think the nature that a lot of the discussion around policy and things like that is a bit oriented around barriers. There's the other side of the coin in terms of facilitators, enablers. And you've started to mention some of those in terms of, community engagement, community groups, involving people. You've also highlighted a lot of stereotypes in terms of your white middle class, people like us stuff. And the other side of that. So trying to identify types that aren't typical. But how it kind of seems to come down to like the core bit of Rick's point about the purpose of the institution. Do you think there really is a movement towards science for everybody, or is it science for the scientists and the white fields? And do you think that matters? Do you think that's an issue?
So I guess I still have loads of naive views around the world, and the reason I like science engagement is because I buy into, on some kind of idealistic level, loads of stuff around, well, if science is there and it's that socially valued, then we need to open that up. That needs to be, you need to be able to learn about it, you need to be able to critique it, you need to be able to understand it when you read it in the news, you need to be able to talk back to it. That I think is important in the same way as any kind of political issue. It's important to have that opened up. But I also think, it's important to see that as an ideal, because if we look at practice, that seems to not happen again and again and again, and we can perhaps think about where and how and why that might be limited. But I still like that ideal. So I would definitely support a kind of science for all agenda. I think it's a great idea, and that's not the same as saying everyone has to do it, right? So that's not like I don't want to go to a football match, I'm allowed to not go to a football match. But it's important for me to have the choice of feeling like I could go to a football match if I decided I wanted to, or if I, in 10 years, decided that was something that was important to me. And I think that's what we don't have right now. So what this stuff suggested to me was actually there's lots of people, and I'm looking at maximally out of it people. So we're not talking about minority ethnic middle classes, for example, where patterns of behaviour are very different potentially, or the white working class and how people around that might or might not fit into different kinds of behaviours. But I felt like the people I was working with, they didn't even have the choice to do these things. They were out of it in every possible way that they could be out of it. And so I think that's crucially important. As to whether anyone shares that view beyond the rhetoric, I would like to say, I feel increasingly suspicious about it.
No, not going to let you around. Okay, so that's the vision. It's been a vision like that for at least 20 years. So why is it not happening? What are the facilitators? What are the institutional changes that we need to put into place to make it happen?
Well, I think we're looking at privilege, right? So if we put on our full Bourdieu cynicism hats, which is the hat I like, I think we're looking at the reproduction of disadvantage is also the reproduction of advantage, right? So people like their advantages. And so the social mobility argument that we have social mobility that's undercut by the argument that, you know, the idiot children of rich people don't in fact end up being unemployed and being incredibly disadvantaged. They still often do quite well, would suggest that perhaps that kind of, that's in a way a dream that doesn't happen in our society. And I think that the way I was talking earlier about this idea of resource mapping onto resource, a lot of this is set up in that manner, so that if you're at a good school with a lot of good teachers, you have, you know, a decent amount of time to spend with you and are financially rewarded to do so, they can set up enough after school clubs and school trips, and perhaps your parents have sent you to that kind of school because they come from a certain background, and they might take you to places at the weekend or send you to holiday clubs, and that over a lifetime is a sort of cultural capital model of how advantage is maintained and accrued. And so I think we're looking at a system in the same way as Bourdieu's book on reproduction and education. I think this in a way is a case study of that. So the people who it doesn't work for become disposed against it, the people who it works for become disposed towards it, and it's all reproduced quite neatly. And there's not really much work. There is, I think, because it's a system, right? If you can understand it, maybe you can get in there and disrupt it. But is there much investment in disruption? It's my evil. I don't know. Is any?
Pass on to Nick, because my question was kind of like.
I'm not sure if I've got a question. It's more things that made me think about and whether they make sense to you as well. Like, so yeah, I'm not. Given that I've also in the past been interested in bell hooks a bit as well, I'm not surprised when you put a science centre and bell hooks up against each other, next to each other, you're going to get like they don't match very well. Because what you made me think about was that if you followed through a bell hooks logic in a science centre, you'd get all sorts of big political challenges about democratisation of knowledge production, democratisation of the museum itself, what should be in a museum, all the things that Rick said right at the start, you know, what is a museum for? Bell hooks would want those questions asked pretty early on in this process, and you don't get asked those questions when you walk into a science museum.
No, and science I think is different on that front as well. Absolutely. It sort of exacerbates some of that.
Yeah, stuff. I mean some art places, art centres as you mentioned, are kind of actively experimenting with those kind of issues, but yeah, science is and social history museums, and where I've seen amazing examples are community-run museums, which have, you know, just handwritten signs in 5 different community languages, and they've set the whole thing up themselves, and it is, you know, owned and staffed by people. Yeah, and the ideal, I mean, I think there's a history of those. I mean, I don't not explore museums, but the history of science and technology museums is very much aligned with the history of industrialisation and with, you know, the birth of the middle class, and, you know, the whole model of industrial production, which is about, so it's about pulling the working class along by saying, look at all this amazing knowledge we've got, and look what we can do if we reproduce these relations of, you know, of production and consumption, etc., etc. So there's very, very big issues at stake in those kind of V&A science museum type places to do with, you know, big societal, the way we organise society. Yeah. So these are the sorts of things that, you know, that we're going to come up against if we try and change how knowledge is reproduced, transmitted, or disrupted in those sort of contexts. So I agree with everything you say, but I can see also that yeah, I'm not at all surprised that it is as it is at the moment. And there was, but I do think one of the things I thought was really, one of the other things that was really interesting was that so there's this ideal visitor image that you came up with, which spectre. Yeah, spectre of that, which was in a way this ideal public of, you know, grateful and pro-science. Yeah, grateful, relatively passive, wanting to learn about knowledge as it is already. You know, not necessarily questioning of the relations of power through which that knowledge has been produced, as against perhaps your public that I think you could argue that you constituted that public through your research.
Yeah.
So that public, that marginal audience wasn't recognised by that ideal public, because that ideal public is, you know, it's got all sorts of problems with it, but it sets itself up as an inclusive public. It may not be, it's obviously not an inclusive public, but it sets itself up, that ideal visitor is part of an inclusive public. Anyone, you know, it says we're for everyone.
Yeah.
It may not be true, as you've obviously found out, but your public is now a kind of counter-public to that. So not until you actually brought them together and took them in and got them to ask questions, they weren't a public. Mm-hmm. Do you see what I mean? In this way of thinking.
So I think, do you know Norcha Maris?
Yeah.
So I think about her idea of the interest constituting the public quite a lot, and I think in a way for these guys, yeah, they're a grassroots community group, but their interest in this stems from me hanging around so long. They eventually felt sorry for me enough to do the stuff, right?
So telling you you're a public.
I was like, come on, let's do. And so I was rocking up with like cake, and they were rocking up with whatever, stews and chickens and other cakes, and we were just hanging out until they were like, well, look, this poor girl. Yeah. And then they did some of the stuff with me, and through it, obviously, that constitutes a degree of interest building and motivation development and that kind of focus on what's happening. But I think the long-term stuff, I mean, it's sort of, there's still people I'm in touch with, so in terms of like with exit strategies and withdrawal from the field, I'm not good at that, they're still all there. But that's not an ongoing thing for them, and I think that fits to me with Norcha's idea of like how these publics kind of come into being and then dissipate again.
But I guess in terms of the politics of it, it's more likely, you're more likely to be effective in your campaign, if I can call it that, if you constitute yourself as an activist group, than if you go to the Science Museum and say, oh, it doesn't make sense that you're not revolutionising the way you produce knowledge, because it's probably more likely that they'll listen if they've got a group of people keep banging on the door from outside than if you go to see the head of knowledge reproduction at the Science Museum.
Which I think is their title, right?
Because they're probably, their interests are not necessarily aligned.
And I think in a really simplistic way, when I started doing the PhD, it was literally because we'd done a project that was not very good, and it was trying to be inclusive, and it was pretty dreadful, and I was looking around for something to help me. Like, there were no tools, there was no report or paper being like, hey, here are some ideas. There was none of that. So I was like, all right, so let me just check what everyone knows, and spent a year doing presentations in places like BIG and various other VSG going, well, hey, practitioner guys, what are you up to? What's the state of the art on this? What practices are you guys doing? And there was nothing really there. So I started to go, okay, well, maybe you've got to keep digging through this. And one of the things I encountered that people said to me a lot was this, well, we are inclusive, it's not an issue. So in a way, the practice was legitimated by, there is no top tips or whatever on this, there is no best practice guideline, there is no literature review that brings it all together, because we do this, we are inclusive, this visiting public is inclusive, this is everyone, what's your problem? And so in a way that almost the design was about, well, let's just go and find some of these non-publics, and in a way to leverage them for sure, to go, look, here is this doesn't fit, here's the example, here's another example, here's another example. And I think that's quite interesting. And so that challenge now is quite, I think, painful for practitioners and sometimes kind of difficult, because a lot of people are very sold on their own practice. And so to go into that critically is really difficult. Especially if you're not like, if you're an academic, you're trained to be like super critical, horrible, reflective practitioner on everything, like your teaching, your research, all this stuff. And if without that, actually, it's quite hard to be like, oh, maybe everything we're doing with families doesn't work. Or maybe it recreates exclusive practices. And that, I think, is quite, seems to me to have been very hard for people to manage to cope with or to respond to in their working practices.
But not for your groups that you work with, is it?
No, and it makes, it makes perfect sense to them. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's one woman who was telling me this horrifying story of being stared at by security guards until she left a museum. And I was like, oh, okay, sorry, nothing, yeah.
Right, we're going to have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid, because we're running up to another session for us, I believe. But it was fantastic. I'd just like to thank you again, Emily, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.